Hello and welcome to the SONAR and Genlogs Compliance Crunch webinar. I'm Zach Strickland, Head of Market Intelligence at SONAR. We've got Thomas Wasson from FreightWaves, who is our trucking market expert, and Ryan Joyce from Genlogs, who will help dive through some of the unique data sets that they have as well in this capacity crunch webinar. And, just to kind of start things off and kick things off, for those of you that aren't familiar, here's kind of a quick rundown of what we've seen over the last week. We've got the ICE raids happening in the Midwest, largely focusing on obviously the immigrants and some of the Eastern European bloc immigrants that was reported on freightwaves.com. And it looked like it had kind of this targeted influence over the spot market. We did not see a huge influence on the contract data, especially the data that biases towards the larger shippers and larger carriers. We're going to dive into that for a bit, but also Genlogs data. We're going to get to learn about that a little bit, and Ryan's going to tell us about that. But they have some interesting takeaways from some of the stuff they see in their data. But first things first, Ryan, let's get an introduction around Genlogs and what exactly it is that you guys do.
Absolutely. Happy to share. So I'm Ryan Joyce, CEO of Genlogs. Genlogs has a nationwide network of roadside cameras that we have in place along all major interstates, freight lanes, highways. We've placed those from California to New York, from Minnesota down to Miami, and almost everywhere in between. Every day, we're collecting about 15 million images of trucks across that sensor network. And on a regular basis, we'll collect on, let's say, 88% of all of the DOTs that are active with the DOT. We actually are collecting on them. We're collecting down to the individual VINs in those fleets. And therefore, we're able to really look at patterns over time to understand what are the unique numbers of US DOTs that we regularly see, let's say on a daily or weekly basis, as well as individual trucks out there, in order to shed some light on some of the market cycles that we might be witnessing, reading about, rumors existing. We can actually look at what does the data say. So that's the background on Genlogs.
Good stuff. So Ryan, let's lean right into it. I read the white paper. The white paper is of course out, and it's interesting to me that based on your data, you count unique carrier operators and how frequently you see them on the roads, and you really didn't see a meaningful change in the data until this past month. Is that right?
Yeah, what we saw is it was pretty holding steady, let's say, over the last few months in terms of unique US DOTs that we observed on the roads. And yet you can see in the chart above, looking over the last month, so starting September 10th through October 10th, and I actually just pulled some updated data today, and we saw it kind of flattened out with regards to no longer a precipitous drop, but we did see about a 6.7% drop of unique US DOTs that we observed out there on the roads. And that happened over the last month, and it accelerated really over the last few weeks. And this is, we often see new entrants to the market. So each month, the DOT's issuing a bunch new motor carrier numbers or US DOT numbers. So we see new ones come in, and then old ones leaving. And recently, I saw another article today that was talking through that for the first time in a while, we've actually seen a net exit, a decrease. So we've seen more DOTs go inactive or close down their authorities than we have new authorities coming online. That was actually reflected as well in the Genlogs data in terms of unique DOTs that we're observing out there on the roads. I took it a step further to then look at the unique trucks on the roads. And we can do that through a number of different ways. We can do that through license plates sometimes, or just unique cab numbers within associated with the unique US DOT. And what we saw there is actually a 3% decrease. So really minor, and it's really hard to almost see that on the second chart at the bottom there, but that red line is touching kind of where that peak was on around September 10th. And then through the rest of September, we saw this little creep down in terms of numbers of unique trucks that were out there on the roads. And the reason I like to present these two together is, you might have US DOTs, like you might have 100 different carriers with different US DOT or MCs numbers all leave the market. But if all of them only have one truck that they're operating, so there are 100 owner operators, and 100 DOTs leave, but only one carrier joins, but that carrier now has 101 trucks, then you're actually net in terms of capacity up is one truck from 100 leaving to 101 coming in. So in addition to the DOTs, which might tell a story about our carriers shuttering their doors or they leaving the market, we also like to look at those unique truck counts to say, hey, is the actual capacity though any different, or did we just have one DOT with 5 trucks leave the market and sell their trucks to a new DOT with and all of a sudden they had now net up 5, but there's really no decrease in capacity. And what we actually saw was really minor, but 3%. And 3% would be enough to move the needle in some markets. And that likely is reflective of why SONAR was capturing a few of the markets had some significant spot rate jumps, at least in this last week.
Yeah. And then here's, of course, the chart that you have in the white paper that you so eloquently wrote. And it's interesting to me that this was largely, Gary, Indiana, Sioux Falls, Green Bay, Wisconsin, St. Cloud, Minnesota, not directly Chicago markets, but, there is an Eastern European presence in the Midwest there, especially around the Chicago area. In SONAR, we also saw pretty strong responses around Rock Island, Illinois, and which is on the border there of Iowa, over the last week. And it looked like it was very concentrated in this Midwestern section. And I know that the headlines were, Craig Fuller, the CEO of FreightWaves, wrote the article, and he kind of got a little pushback saying, like, you're pumping the market. And it's like, he doesn't really have a motivation to pump the market here. But this was such a quick and violent move that we really haven't seen over the last year outside of some kind of foreseen events. Like, I'm pulling up the NTI here, and this is the measure of aggregated dry van spot loads exclusive of estimated fuel costs, just to kind of make sure that fuel spiking, even though fuel's been relatively flat for a bit, doesn't have an influence here. And you can see these mountains that we're seeing. And Thomas and I were talking about this before the webinar. A lot of the rhetoric here is like, is this sort of like a mini road check week? And if you look in May, where you see the sharp increase in spot rates, that's a right around road check week, which is about 3 days of increased inspection activity. And of course, this was like 2 weeks after the English language proficiency announcement from the government came out, saying that they were going to target people that could not pass a basic language proficiency exam, which is actually already kind of inside the regulatory handbook, but states just weren't encouraged to enforce it yet. Now, Thomas, I'm going to ask you, this is such you can see Road Check Week did have an influence in the previous 2 years. This specific time frame that we're looking at, there was only like a 2 or 3% increase in spot rates, but it was unique in the sense that there was no story. Nobody saw this coming. Is this the reason that this is more meaningful in the way that this kind of took the market off guard, or is this more of a, it took a minute and it influenced such a small portion of the population that it's going to be a blip?
Well, the answer is right now we're in the fog of war. So we look at that chart over the last 2 years. You notice that we do have between October to the middle of October, we have rate movements as well, typically associated. You get an end of month kind of boost. But one of the things I think about is that we know structurally this will take capacity out of the market for 3 different ways. The first one is English language proficiency placing you out of service. That negatively impacts your scores. You get worse scores. You get inspected more. It's a bad snowball. So we know that's going to have one impact on capacity. The second and the third, though, are directly related to the influx of new drivers. And so with the concept of the non-domiciled CDLs, One of the reasons that we did see a decrease, but we didn't see a huge decrease, is because you need two things if you have a non-domiciled CDL. The first one is you need the CDL. That's got to be in good standing. The second one is you need a form of work visa, I-9, green card, documentation, something of that nature. And so the challenge is there are carriers who operate very much on the spot market. There are mega carriers who also utilize non-domiciled CDLs, but the ones who are kind of pushing the limits are the ones that typically are more spot. We talked about the whole Eastern European. You think about Chicago, you think of like Elk Grove, Illinois, parts of California. There are areas where it's a business practice where you'll see fleets from 10, 50, 700 trucks that almost exclusively hire these types of drivers. So what does that mean? Well, one carrier that had a little over 600 drivers, 400 of them were in good standing. That's not a problem. The problem was 200 of them were not, which meant that their work visas or their CDLs or something was expired. That's a huge problem. And so based on conversations, with the increase of immigrations located at inspection sites, the real fear is not being placed out of service. You can always get another driver to pick up your truck. The problem is what if your guy gets deported? So there's a lot of challenges and concerns. The final part, which I think stealthily will cause a capacity crunch in the coming months, is that there are additional in terms of Department of Transportation, DOT and motor carrier numbers, there is TSA level kind of compliance checks. You've got to provide the documentation. You've got to have the actual residence. It's being reviewed. No longer can we just willy-nilly put it out of Thomas's house and have like 5 trucking companies. If you are renewing it, you have to go through this additional check. That is limiting the amount. We saw that earlier this year in conversations where the amount of new entrants has lowered because they can't pass the background check in order to make it. So the three-way stool that I'm thinking about right now is people who are afraid of getting deported is one impact. That's going to be what we saw with our bump. This is really kind of a psychological thing. The second one is that we're seeing increased scrutiny placed on the renewal of your motor carrier number. So that will have an impact on the type of ones entering the market. And then finally, with this non-domiciled thing, it's full stop right now. So you cannot get a new non-domiciled CDL. So you're not even going to get a test for it. The states have stopped that. FMCSA is like, nope, a big old hold. And then if you are trying to renew your non-domiciled CDL, that's another problem. Now, there have been some talks of states deciding to revoke, but it has not really gone far yet. The problem is, from a compliance standpoint, let's say that I came into California and I got an 8-year or 6-year CDL, but my work visa is only 3 years. Well, for some of these drivers, it's year 4. My CDL is still good. I'm going to keep on driving and test my luck. And so that's one of the challenges that we're seeing right now, is that it's still the fog of war, because right now we're coming up on Q4, which is trucking's peak season. So there's going to be a lot of fuzzy data. But one thing I like about the Genlogs is that there's finally a tool to figure out what's happening with these fleets, because one of the big things we're going to have to pay close attention to is, I used to call it hustling freight. You don't haul freight, you hustle freight. Everyone's getting an edge. Will these carriers who had these drivers in poor safety scores switch to a backup MC? If you're doing a good laundering, what you do is you get yourself a compliance school in another state, you launder it over a bunch of shell companies that each have a motor carrier that are aged, you have 1 or 2 assets, and a lot of them are leased. So pay close attention, because as we're seeing these unique VINs, see if they're getting tied into a certain motor carrier. Because if I'm of a certain type of proclivity and I decide that this motor carrier is borked because my score is really bad, I'm going to rotate those assets, I'm going to sell them, or I'm going to move them over to another MC that is good and in good standing with a broker. The old joke was, I got to pull out my other MC and you're good to go. That still exists, but looking ahead, it will get harder.
Yeah, I think the thing that I'm most curious about is, looking at this chart right here, we can see the spot rate has been having a natural inflationary pressure on it. It's very similar in tender rejection data, which biases towards your larger fleets and larger operators, larger shippers. This one moved kind of independently of the tender rejection rates, which is, this felt like a much smaller carrier, owner operator, spot heavy broker kind of environment. And I want to ask Ryan, the question here is, it's interesting to me that you talked about how we really didn't see a meaningful decline in the truck population or the driver population or the unique DOT population until just recently, whereas the FMCSA data was kind of showing us that this was a fairly capacity off environment. But I think you said it right when you said the amount of trucks coming off the road down 3% over the last bit is actually a fairly indicative stat. Why is it so different in September? Is it purely ice generated, or is this just more of a structural thing that's actually going to start to manifest in a more permanent fashion moving forward?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think one of the things that we still need to do is look at what are the patterns of those DOTs that are coming off. And it's some additional data that I just didn't have time to pull for the white paper for this presentation. But, we can actually get even a better bead on how many trucks are average in these fleets coming off the roads and where are they generally domiciled. And so if we saw those domiciled in the, Illinois area, and the thinking was that this was somehow related to Eastern European enforcement crackdown or whatnot, that could tell more of the story. The screen you're showing right now is one of the fleets that specifically I chose because it had been reported to me from a broker that said, hey, we just got loads returned to us from this carrier, said that their drivers just did not show up in mass this week. And they're not going to be able to run those loads for us. Here's the MC. What can you show me about that? And I actually looked at in our data what that carrier looked like over the last few months. This was a carrier that had 92 trucks registered to it as claimed on their most recent MCS 150 filed with the FMCSA. And when we looked at, 3 years back, a year back, they were operating in all lower 48 continental United States. But in the last month, we saw them start to evaporate off the roads. In the last week, we'd only seen them operating in 3 states. And by the time I pulled the data, we had not seen them in the last 24 hours. So this is truly a carrier that was operating at least 92 trucks on the roads that had completely disappeared. And it was reported, the reason that they were reported to not be covering loads is because the drivers themselves were worried about the being stopped at these inspection stations, being questioned and potentially being arrested by ICE officials. And that at least was anecdotally shared to us. What was interesting about this carrier, beyond just the fact that they were disappearing from the roads, is that if you looked at their compliance or some of their deeper FMCSA data with regards to their inspection selection score, that's that ISS score on the upper left hand that's kind of boxed around with that red square. They had an 85, which means that they required immediate inspection. So as they're going by any inspection station, they are going to be pulled in for immediate inspection. That was based off the fact that they had a 78% hours of service rating. Now, the FMCSA, what is public is that they have a 0.54 measure score within that. That doesn't really mean something to anyone. You don't know, like 0.54 is that good or bad. Genlogs has taken it a step further and actually reverse engineered what the percentage is, which really leads to whether you require an inspection or not as you pass by. These drivers would know, if they're driving for that fleet, that every time they pass an inspection station, they're being pulled in and they're being inspected. And if they know that, and the word or the rumor is out there that there's ICE agents at these inspection stations, well, no wonder they said they're not taking these loads. And if they were driving for another fleet where they had a lower inspection selection score that wasn't requiring them to be inspected every time, they might take the chance. But when you know that you're going to get inspected and you're hearing rumors that ICE is posted up at these inspection stations, and if there's any part in your background or documentation that may not pass the sniff test, then it's no wonder that they decided they're not showing up, and no wonder that those trucks just stopped operating on the roads. And that's what we saw, at least in this one case. And I would suspect that in the last few weeks, there has been a correlation between some of the reporting on increased enforcement on the roads, whether that's the English language proficiency enforcement or just simply the rumors, whether they're true or not, of ICE agents being at inspection stations or at shipper warehouses, that could lead to that correlation of certain DOTs, especially DOTs with one or two trucks there, that just say, we're just not going to risk it, and that they all of a sudden aren't bidding on loads, they aren't out there on the roads. I think what we're going to be looking at Genlogs is, are they simply taking a break? Do we see some of those DOTs that haven't been observed for the last week, and that therefore that's why we saw that 6% drop? Do they come back to the roads, or do they remain off the roads? That's really what we'll be looking at over the coming weeks.
Ryan, have y'all done any studies or any back-end data that kind of identifies what percentage of the population of capacity is at risk here? Or, you have an 85 right here. Is there something that says, well, 25% of the operators are actually considered to be at risk for, not just the Eastern European, but also the Spanish speaking? We have a lot of Mexican driver population here. I think the majority, the numbers I've read have been like 60% come from the Americas, the Caribbean, Latin America, South America, and then the rest of them kind of are that Eastern European and Indian population, foreign born.
Yeah, so I'll be really clear that what Genlogs does not do is really focus on any driver demographics or metrics or this and that, unless there has been a reported English language proficiency issue reported to that, or at least associated with that carrier.
Right.
But you did mention there for a second the Mexican drivers here. And I don't know if you have, I didn't really have a metric or a graph for it, so I can kind of chat through it a little bit. But this might have been lost for those that did see the white paper. It was kind of the caption was the imminent Southern capacity crunch. And this is really interesting because there has been a lot of talk about how often are Mexican or Canadian carriers operating inside the United States, potentially engaging in cabotage operations, essentially taking freight from a domestic origin to domestic destination within the US. And that has been really like an unknown, like no one's been able to put a true metrics on it or quantify that in any given way. It's a lot of, hey, I saw a Mexican plate on a truck at a truck stop here in Oklahoma, and this is a big issue. Well, Genlogs actually took a look at the data on this. And it's interesting that Mexican carriers that operate in the US can do so under two different certifications. There's the OP1 certification, which allows a handful of Mexican carriers to actually take long haul loads from the border, like across Laredo, let's say, and they could go as far as Chicago and drop off there, but then they need to go directly back to the border. They can't take an intra-US load. That would be cabotage there. So there's a handful of carriers that have that OP1 certification. But on many more carriers, and Genlogs has observed over 5,500 Mexican carriers that have this OP2 certification. OP2 allows them to cross the border, but they have to remain in the commercial zones, essentially right along the border. So it's about, let's say, 30 miles from the Laredo border crossing, by example. They can kind of bring it to a cross-dock facility there. Then they drop off that load, or they drop off the trailer, and then they have to go right back over the border. Genlogs has actually observed 972 unique Mexican carriers with that OP2 certification restriction actually operating outside of that commercial zone, deeper inside the United States. And some of the most egregious violators we've observed over 20 different states, as far north as Minnesota, Wisconsin, Illinois, New York. Like we've seen them all the way up into New England. These are Mexican carriers that by law should not even be exceeding that commercial zone within 30 miles of the border, yet are taking loads deep into the United States. And those are loads that otherwise would have been taken by American carriers. And we've seen this behavior tens of thousands of times across those 972 carriers. And we looked at how many Mexican carriers we see in the Laredo area, because we do have our sensors deployed there. That 972 is about 17% of Mexican carriers observed on our sensors in the Laredo areas are ones that actually have exceeded and violated that commercial zone perimeter. So the reason I mention that is this is an element that has been reported to the U.S. Department of Transportation, and I know that they are eager to crack down on this. So it's almost like the next wave that we haven't yet seen yet. You saw the English language proficiency, then there's the non-immigrant driver kind of inspections by ICE. This next wave is going to be looking at Mexican and Canadian carriers that are violating their OP2 certification perimeter restrictions and actually operating in the United States. We've also seen some of those handful of OP1 carriers that have the long haul ability inside the United States. A few of them we have observed engaging in cabotage. And so those have been reported to the Department of Transportation. This is something that Department of Transportation, either alone or in concert with Department of Homeland Security as the enforcement mechanism, can and will, I believe, crack down on this in the coming weeks and months. And that could additionally put pressure on the available capacity out there that, albeit illegal, has been capacity that is hauling freight on the roads and is leading to more carriers carrying less freight. And that's why you have these rates being low. And so if all of a sudden that crackdown happens and those tens of thousands of times that we see those Mexican carriers operating deeper inside the United States, that could also lead to additional squeeze on capacity and higher rates.
Yeah, I pulled back to the original chart here of the spot rate increases that were happening last week. El Paso sitting right here, and it definitely feels like the southern border would be more of the target or the first place that we would see some of this increasing activity, and not necessarily in the Midwest. But at the same time, this is a different style of situation. Thomas, I'm going to pivot back to you here and kind of rephrase the question. We didn't really see a huge influence on the larger contract market environment, which is really what I need to say that this is a meaningful moment in the freight market dynamic, to say that we're at an inflection point and that capacity is legitimately close enough to equilibrium with demand that we're going to have a meaningful flip. How much of the market itself do you think that this type of regulatory behavior influences and can potentially remove or inhibit? If you have any estimates, I think I went out there and I found that, it was like 2021 data said that as much as 16 to 18% of the market was sort of this foreign born, and it doesn't mean that they're illegal, mind you. Want to be careful enough to say that. But, that was 2021, and we've had this boom in capacity. And how much of it actually influences this larger fleet environment that obviously these carriers tend to go through a little bit more structural vetting processes on top of things just to make sure that they're not exposed. So first question, how much just overall capacity do you think this actually influences? And then how much of the larger fleets are exposed or at risk to this?
Great question. I wanted to add one last thought on that OP2. Werner CEO Derek Leathers at a recent conference had talked about how they had observed OP2 carriers staying out on average 21 days. And it used to be you go by the county line. So you can't leave the county line on these border zones, but these guys are out for 3 weeks. And so that was one example of a large carrier saying they're being negatively impacted by cabotage. But one of the things for large carriers is this will be a long-term problem for them if the non-domiciled pipeline continues to be frozen. So think of your large carriers like CR England, Prime, and others. They have non-domiciled drivers, but they have a safety and compliance department. So there's always someone to make sure that is your license good and is your work visa, your I-9, and your documentation good. So it's not as if large carriers don't employ large populations of foreign-born drivers. It's just they have a better way to wrangle it, and they have their own schools and pipelines to get them. Now, this will become a problem in at least a year. I think the average odds right now when I worked at a large carrier was half my fleet would be gone by 6 months, and I have to hire my entire fleet by the end of the year. So it was estimated about 100,000 new drivers for these CDL schools may be left out into the cold if the non-CDL thing stands. Now, we do have some legislation from the American Trucking Associations and a few congressmen. They are trying to find ways to, reopen the pipeline for certain ways, but it will eventually trickle down through attrition for these large carriers. We like to highlight the sketchy operators with 5 different MC numbers, and they rotate it around and they use sketch balls, but there is a legitimate hustle to this as well if you do want to use foreign-born labor, and large carriers, will be exposed just as much. It just takes a little bit longer, similar to how it took a minute for the cruise ship to run out of water, and then we had that Netflix documentary. So it does take a little bit, but we will see some impacts. The cabotage thing is important. Large trucking associations have been talking about it for years. That's why one of the things the non-domiciled CDL kind of had a grassroots movement in terms of pushback against foreign drivers and these sketchball carriers. But, if I'm thinking of the total impact for large carriers, right now we will not see it. If it prolongs past 6 months, we should see instances. We're going to have to pay attention to truck counts and their quarterly earnings. Are they lowering it? Are they complaining about the influx of new drivers? This does have a risk. So it's not as if this is isolated. Right now it is isolated in the spot market activity. That's why outbound tender rejection rates have not meaningfully risen, because most of these players are operating at the periphery in spot markets. If anyone's a freight broker, you remember strong solo Sergi, he'll get it there. But you saw the out of service. Pull the out of service chart. I want to show you one thing on that as well. This is one of the big things as well. Look at that hours of service thing on there. That means that they're utilizing, there we go, 78%. That's a big problem. So if we're thinking about the impacts and stuff, I think 2 things, and you'll have to re-ask me the second question because I was really distracted on the first one. The first one is large carriers utilize it. We will see it in the coming months if nothing is done. If the non-domiciled CDL pipeline is reopened and you can go through your schools with your I-9 documents and get your CDL, they're not going to really have too big of a problem. It's really just finding ways to feed the beast because of a high turnover issue.
Yeah, that was actually my second question. The first question was around like total hit to the market itself, like in terms of overall capacity influence. Like I think the number I read was like 16 to 18% from 2021 has some rough influence here. I would expect that number to have grown in recent years. I didn't know if you had any figures.
Yeah. So I think right now the demand is just not there. Tariffs have really impacted domestic manufacturing. Look at the PMI. It's estimated like 70 or 80% of all freight moved in the U.S. is domestic. So, we love to talk about imports and how imports drive things like peak seasons and surges. That's the icing on our freight cake. The most of the cake is this domestic moves. I don't know if nearshoring is going to be enough. Now, if we do see a lot of moves against these OP2s and Mexican-based capacity, that may have an impact. We can do a whole webinar on capacity concerns over Mexican-based carriers and the fact that we recognize their CDLs when I can pay $5,000 to get a fake one. But that's another story. One of the big challenges, I think, though, overall, is that we are coming up on Q4, so it's going to be very fuzzy. We're in the fog of war. We have lower volumes. Now, come January and February and March, the indicators I'm looking at will be, are we going to see spot market rates start dropping by the middle part of January, or will they stay out longer? Is it going to be related to weather? Because it's kind of like Goldilocks. We don't know what the right number of trucks to loads is. We know diagonally and orthogonally and everything via spot market rates, tender rejection rates, and tender volumes. But because we are having all of these regulatory moves at a time where we consistently expect to see rising rates, it's going to be extremely difficult. It's going to make the next few months interesting. I think with Genlogs is going to be in a really great position and an advantage because having the unique identifiers is going to be great. And one of the things I'd like to see as well is, will we suddenly see new motor carriers or motor carriers that are active that have been either kind of not operating for 1 or 2 years, or they're suddenly operating in 48 states with self-reported trucks of like 50? Because in the instance of that one sketchy carrier who suddenly stopped all movement, The question I'm asking is, am I pulling out my backup MC number? Because if I am really good at hustling, I'm going to have this laundered enough that I have a few extra shell companies. And so we got to go through our bag of tricks before we start running out of motor carrier numbers. And then we have the additional TSA levels things to get new motor carrier numbers. So it's almost like you have to exhaust your other fake companies. And so the Genlogs will be fun. If I see a bunch of VINs and you kind of have to tie it to the cell, that would be very fascinating to see, because that's going to be the next thing. And then the final thing I'm thinking about with capacity is pay attention to the medium duty space, class 3 through 6, anything under 26,000 pounds, because while my CDL is still active, my I-9 may not be. I'm just going to drive a box truck, because those regulations for intrastate are like really loosey-goosey. So if you start seeing some sketchy stuff with box trucks taking their tops off, you know that they went from trucking and then matriculated on down. So there's so many questions. But yeah, we know it will have an impact. Supply and demand, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to know that this will take capacity out. The problem is, with demand being so crappy, it makes it really difficult to find that Goldilocks sweet spot for us to establish a baseline to know the extent of how screwed we may be if I'm a shipper or a broker who utilizes this capacity.
Yeah, so Ryan, I'm gonna pivot back to you on this one. So what Thomas is talking about, we've seen demand side conditions represented there in the yellowish greenish line there really deteriorate for the truckload market over the last year. A lot of that is just modal conversion. A lot of shippers have lengthened their lead times as they've been trying to avoid tariffs and some of this pull forward environment. So that gives them plenty of time to move freight across the country. And then, of course, there was a little bump of the North American activity due to the USMXCA agreement there that was targeted there earlier in the year. So this has turned into kind of a discussion around, we've got this larger contract market represented by the tender data. And then we have this, which has been impacted demand side pretty significantly. But we also have this kind of smaller operator environment in the spot market. That's where the rates have been suppressed the most, because it's 250,000 carriers competing against each other. My question for you here is, are you seeing anything in your data? And this is a little off the cuff because I'm just interested. And if you don't have the answer, I wouldn't blame you. But are you seeing anything in your data that kind of identifies this bifurcation that we see in the spot rate data versus the tender data, which is much more contract, larger carrier centric data, where the smaller market, their smaller operator environment's been more influenced by some of these recent things, and the larger carriers are a little bit more insulated. Is that true in the data?
I have a very little to shed light on this now, because it's something that we are building out so that a year from now, I'll be able to shed so much more light for you. It's interesting because we can actually look at a bit on the commodities that are being carried, especially if we observe on the flatbed or hoppers or cattle, haulers. We can see generally, hey, is there more or less week over week, month over month? And really where we want to get to is year over year to understand, hey, do we see more flatbed utilization in certain areas that have, lumber being hauled or whatnot, that might talk about construction, and obviously more home building, more construction around the board. That's just going to be good overall. And you're going to have to put furniture in those new buildings and whatnot. And that's what we want to see in order to see a healthy freight market. We can actually observe those. I just don't know what to compare it to, because we weren't collecting that, let's say, 2 years ago. So a little bit, it's going to have to be looked at from a year-over-year basis to get to the point where kind of as mature as SONAR to look at 2023, 2024, and beyond, to kind of see where we are and what those trends look like. I will say, though, that we are able to observe logos on trailers. And so it's been interesting to actually look at some of the retailers out there, Walmart, Amazon, Target, and a handful of others, and look, hey, what are we observing with regards to the frequency that those trailers are observed on the roads? And with regards to both Amazon and Walmart, we have seen a little bump over the last month. I think that's probably to be expected as we get closer to the holiday season here. But with regards to Amazon, it's interesting because of their relay program, which really relies more on these smaller carriers to haul those trailers around the roads and everything that's in there. And so we may actually be seeing and Amazon's up more than Walmart and Target. Target's rather flat. Walmart's been, they were up about a week ago. They're starting to kind of like come down a little bit more. Amazon's continuing to creep up. So there's a lot of purchases already starting to happen on Amazon, or at least a lot of positioning for kind of your Black Friday coming up here. And with Amazon's heavy reliance on these smaller carriers through their relay program, that could put a little bit of pressure on the spot market with regards to where a lot of these carriers often play. And then obviously, if you don't see more healthy tender rejection rates or some of those contract carriers just continuing with the anemic freight levels that they've had, that wouldn't surprise me. And that is what we might be observing in our data, is that you have some of those retailers, and specifically ones that rely on smaller carriers to carry their loads, increasing. And that's why you have less spot market, or at least smaller carriers available, especially if there's been pressure from the enforcement side, whether that's the English language proficiency, ICE enforcement, or whatnot. I think all three of those could be putting pressure on the ability, or what the spot market looks like, especially with these smaller carriers. But stay tuned. We have a little bit more maturity we need to do to be able to get you some really hot charts that look at, hey, what has been that, flatbed related construction, and because we look at heavy haul as well, so we could tell you, hey, how many tractors and other large excavators are moving around the country at any given time. And that could be a leading indicator that we maybe see some more activity across the market. But that's what I would have to share right now.
Yeah, I know that I've seen less responsiveness from the flatbed market over the last week than I did with either the refrigerated and the dry van sector, which makes sense. I mean, you mentioned Amazon and Walmart last week. The retailers, of course, having Prime Week, their own little versions of Prime Week. I think a lot of these retailers have kind of jumped in to the Amazon playbook of discounting stuff heavily in October, which is traditionally a dead period of time. Actually, when we were seeing the front leading edge of the spot rate increasing last week, Craig and I were having this discussion, and I was like, could this be because it's, Prime Week in October? And he was like, no, it's a little, we would have seen that earlier. And of course he's right. I agree with that assessment, but I think it's fascinating that you mentioned the Amazon relay trailers and the fact that they do rely on some of these smaller operators and how influenced that's going to be. Could that mean a conversion to a larger operator environment versus some of these smaller ones? But I think in that, we tend to see rates increase. And I don't know if Amazon is prepared, especially in a soft environment, for that. I think one of my biggest takeaways over the last year is that spot rates, if you look since May, this is kind of, if I showed the 2-year chart to you, spot rates are inflating slowly, just like tender rejection rates are. But that's been kind of the play, is that we're seeing this erosion of, the spot market participation, volume, not necessarily going down, but capacity appears like some of these lower cost providers appear to be exiting. The FMCSA data supports a lot of this. I'll pose this question because we're coming up on time here, and please, anyone that has any questions, type them into the Q&A box down there, and we'll try to get to them. But we're running up on time here, so I want to kind of close this loop and ask. I guess I'll start with you, Thomas, and then I'll let Ryan kind of answer here. I know we're in the fog of war, but what are your thoughts around how this may manifest for the rest of the year? I think the long-term stuff, we all kind of agree it's a little early to say that we're going to see some sort of big inflection point here. But for the rest of the year, do you think that this particular moment in time manifests in some sort of escalation during the fourth quarter? And I'm going to point to you first, Thomas, to let you answer.
It will escalate. We're just not going to know. You mentioned Walmart and Amazon. The reason you saw more Walmart trailers is they're doing their Blitz program. what you'll do is you'll run outbound loads and you'll drop your trailers next to a store, pre-staged and preloaded for Black Friday. So one of the healthy things to see with Walmart in particular is when they're repositioning assets using trailers outside their private network. I think the problem is right now, we will see tender rejections increase. We will see spot rates increase. But the issue is, unless we continue to see tender volumes dip, if volumes keep going down and rejections keep going up, then that would tell me, the dog not barking, that we are seeing an impact because capacity attrition. Now, if we see volumes start going back up as upstream moves downstream and Walmart and Amazon and Target and everyone starts matriculating from their distribution centers, then we know that this is part of a fourth quarter boom and that we're going to have to wait until a period of relative calmness to see if there's a really out of season move. So the big all eyes right now are on the American consumer and outbound tender volumes. If we continue to see poor volumes and better rejection rates, we know something is happening. If we see a crap ton of spot market rates, it like a sled dog is going to drag up that outbound tender rejection rate. Right now, it is way too early to tell. There's a lot of noise. We know structurally this will have an impact. We just don't know what it means to be in the money yet.
All right, Ryan, you're up. Now, I know, Thomas kind of said we're still a little early. The Genlogs data definitely supports this thesis that we are seeing kind of these, targeted carriers that have already had kind of operational difficulty. Do you think that that is going to have a meaningful influence in the fourth quarter, even if rates do kind of start to increase here? I know that's kind of a market analytics question, but I mean,
yeah, I have a few comments on it. So I do think, it will be interesting to continue to watch to see, hey, do we see a rebound in the unique DOTs that we've observed out on the roads? I suspect that if there were some small carriers that decided, hey, because we are hearing rumors of ICE being at inspection stations, we're going to sit it out for a week or two. I think they will be back on the roads here pretty soon, unless there's a sustained enforcement. And so I really think it comes down to, what does U.S. Department of Transportation and Department of Homeland Security decide to do? I know, having spoken with some of those senior officials on both sides, they are pretty serious about cracking down in a sustained way. And they're looking for, how do we make sure that we have American companies that are flourishing and not being, those rates are not falling because we're having illegal activity out there on the roads. And so they do want to crack down on that activity. I think that we didn't even have a true FMCSA director until this last week. And now we have Derek Bars to let him to get up to speed to see, what are some of the issues that are out there, then how he might be able to tackle it. So I do think you're going to see some sustained pressure on the enforcement side. Now, I don't think that even if they are perfect in eliminating every issue on the road, that we're really going to see the market come back until the volumes of freight can, actually go up. And I really think that we're putting a Band-Aid on there, and we're making it, frankly, the industry get to a healthier place. And we want to see an industry that is free of fraud and illegal activity. So I applaud that across the board. But I think that even if that was fully implemented and we shut down all 972 of those Mexican carriers that had those OP2 violations inside the U.S., and any of the cabotage there, and I think if we took off, any of the truly non-domiciled CDL holders that we did not have the proper paperwork that would allow them to continue to operate, if all of that went away, we would see rates go up a little, but not enough to truly be at the place where everyone wants them. And that's only going to happen when the economy recovers from, I think, some of these larger macro issues with regards to the uncertainty around tariffs and whatnot. So if we can get to tackling that we saw the blip over the weekend with Trump, about to raise tariffs on China and then maybe not. And I think it's that uncertainty that we've just seen for almost now a full year now drag on, where large shippers are just not quite sure where they need to position their inventory or their manufacturing facilities. And until they can figure that out and we can get back to the American public, feeling optimistic and making those purchases and then having that freight flow again, we're probably not going to get to the point that everyone feels like, hey, the market's back. So that's my take, is we'll be watching to see, do we see those DOTs come back on the roads, or do they continue to to feel the pressure on the enforcement, which would be a good thing. And then we'll have to see truly, do we actually get to the market that everyone hopes and wants to see?
Yeah, I think I agree with everything you just said. Both great takes. Thank you, Thomas. Thank you, Ryan, for going through this discussion today. Of course, Genlogs also has an integration into SONAR to help anybody that's in SONAR and the SCI platform to kind of vet their carrier base. I think vetting your carriers now is going to become an increasingly important function that I think a lot of people dismiss as kind of an easy, if you haven't been a broker before, you certainly don't understand some of the processes you have to go through to make sure that the carrier is somebody of quality. And Genlogs, of course, assists greatly with that. As you can see here, you can get some data on the back end that helps support that decision. So thank you guys for this. And thank you all for joining for this webinar. It will be, of course, available for anyone that registered to listen to the recording. And hopefully everyone survives the capacity crunch situation as it manifests moving forward, and have a great rest of your week.